Dear colleagues, I'm very glad to contribute to the present People's Global Summit for a new eco-social world with my presentation on development diplomacy for inclusive, sustainable development, peaceful, just, and inclusive societies and a living planet. Development diplomacy represents an innovative diplomatic practice that targets sustainable development and sustaining peace. Development diplomacy applied in actors, relations, and cooperation favors a comprehensive, inclusive, human rights-based, and environmentally sustainable approach for sustainable development. Development diplomacy fosters dialogue and cooperation among and between distinct actors and among societies based on equal terms, non-discrimination, and creating conjointly understanding and trust among them. Thus, as well, favors societal behavioral changes for just and inclusive societies and sustaining a living planet, and hence contribute to building a new eco-social world. In this regard, I will highlight in my presentation the role and value added of development diplomacy to support bottom-up build processes and initiatives in policy and decision making, and to further through dialogue, consensus building, advocacy, negotiation, and mediation, collective actions for inclusive and sustainable development in multi-stakeholder governance spaces, as well as in the interface of multi-level governance, and ultimately showing you how development diplomacy may support building and advance a new eco-social contract. Therefore, I will focus my presentation on development diplomacy for inclusive, sustainable development, peaceful and just and inclusive societies and a living planet, touching the following 4 topics. First, introducing the approach and purpose of development diplomacy, a diplomatic practice specialized on sustainable development issues in the context of contemporary global governance for sustainable development. Second, deepening the fundamentals of development diplomacy's strategy-driven practice for sustainable development and peace, discussing on how they inform development diplomacy at work, as well as how development diplomacy may be applied by actors at the local and global level for building a new eco-social contract to achieve the SDGs. And third, the role and value added of development diplomacy to contribute building and advance a new eco-social contract from the bottom up and progressing to all levels. And concluding remarks then on challenges and perspectives of development diplomacy to further collective actions for sustainable problem solving and contributing to build a new eco-social world. First, I would like to briefly introduce the main features of development diplomacy and its purpose. Today, development diplomacy represents evolving innovative practice in contemporary diplomacy that targets and focuses on inclusive sustainable development and sustaining peace. In fact, development diplomacy developed as a post-Rio conference diplomatic practice on sustainable development. Thus, in the context of the broadening circle of participants, including governments, non-state actors, and civil society organizations, engaged in policy dialogue and policy negotiation in international development issues, as in environmental, social, and human rights spheres. Throughout these processes of debates, talks, and formally negotiations for the agenda setting related to sustainable development, stakeholders made use of the evolving practice of development diplomacy. Following from the context of changing international cooperation and diversity of actors involved in policy debates and negotiations, and the fact that humanity is confronted with new and increasingly more complex interrelated sustainability challenges and systemic risks as climate change, biodiversity mass loss, and increasing inequalities. So a new diplomacy is needed to adapt to these contemporary realities. Diplomacy has to embrace the inclusiveness of concerns related to sustainable development and peace, and in response to forge a new diplomatic culture for sustainable development and peace for the benefit of the people. In this regard, development diplomacy is part of the new diplomacy needed to foster local and global cooperation based on inclusiveness, equality, and respect of human rights for transformative collective actions for sustainable development solutions and governance, aiming inclusive and equitable sustainable development for peaceful, just, and inclusive societies and a living planet. Development diplomacy's practice applied in actors' cooperation is built on a comprehensive, inclusive, human rights-based and environmentally sustainable approach for sustainable development, and strategy driven by the transformative vision to building a peaceful, just and inclusive sustainable world for people, prosperity, and the planet, embodied in the Universal Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. Thus, requests that actors' relations became cooperative, namely based on equal terms and mutual recognition, also presupposing new forms and more inclusive and networked multilateralism and multi-actor coalitions, and transformative collaborative partnerships involving civil society, private sector, and government actors. Also, these are relevant preconditions to building a new eco-social contract. In fact, development diplomacy is in constant reconceptualization, and its comprehensive approach is informed by practice learnings, research findings, and evidence gained mainly during the last 2 decades in different fields of diplomatic work, involving distinct stakeholders at the multilateral, national, and local level, and referring to negotiated and agreed outcomes to further progress in implementing inclusive and equitable sustainable development. Resulting from the advance in sustainable development discourse and priorities and the capitalization of progress of practice at local and global levels, development diplomacy strategy-driven practice is based on essentials and principles, focusing on issues that serve as critical enablers to achieve the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. Following, I would like to deepen these fundamentals of development diplomacy and discussing further on how they inform development diplomacy at work, as well as how development diplomacy may be applied by actors at the local and global level to conduct inclusive cooperation as for building a new eco-social contract to achieve the SDGs. Development diplomacy's strategy-driven practice is steered by 4 fundamentals based on essential and principles which are key to achieve the SDGs through local, national, regional, and global collective actions for sustainable problem solving and governance. To put the transformative vision of the UN Agenda 2030 in practice. Introducing now each of these 4 fundamentals more in depth, I will also highlight aspects which seems to me relevant to show on how the practice of development diplomacy may contribute to building a new eco-social contract. First, development diplomacy integrates at work the environmental, social, and economic dimensions of sustainable development in a holistic and systemic manner across sectors, institutions, and at all levels of governance for policies, norms, and strategies, among others, to achieve the UN Agenda 2030. Also, actors at the collective or individual level applying development diplomacy in negotiation, mediation, and messaging have to adapt to advance the human rights-based approach, making use of the common denominations and mutually reinforcing relationships between human rights conventions and the SDGs to strengthen human rights and further inclusive sustainable development as of in laws, public policies, and multi-stakeholder partnerships. Thus, serves as well to strengthen the accountability of actors in respect with their commitments to the human rights-based approach to development and to the SDGs themselves. Second, development diplomacy as an inclusive and cooperative diplomacy implies mutual recognition among distinct actors based on equal terms and in respect with non-discrimination in all its forms. As well, actors applying development diplomacy have to adopt a reflective practice respecting cultural, religious, and human rights values, including gender equality and diversity, youth, ethnic minorities, and vulnerable social groups, and mediating the differences in terms as of understandings, needs, and policy matters in dialogue, decision-making, and political processes for collective actions for inclusive sustainable development, integrating social, economic, and environmental justice to overcome inequalities in all their forms. In this respect, development diplomacy applies to promote communication and cooperation between distant actors, namely from civil society, business sector, governments, international organizations, and others at the local and multilateral level, in view to build multi-stakeholder coalitions and partnerships for the implementation of the SDGs. Another essential in this respect is the inclusion of the beneficiaries in decision-making processes for sustainable development endeavors, namely through constant communication between organizations, constituencies, or institutions led by either civil society, non-state actors, or governments, whose representatives are negotiating, and those actors who are beneficiaries or impacted by the negotiations. This can be realized through mechanisms of political communication, formal and informal consultations, as for climate policy, gender policies, tax policies, labor issues, and others, with the respective stakeholder groups and citizens to prevent conflict and assure to leaving no one behind, promoting as well awareness building for sustainable development issues. Third, the interlinkages between the global and the local is an essential constant of development diplomacy for the building and implementation of transformative collective actions in response to global challenges and threats, based on shared responsibilities to achieve environmental sustainability, inclusive sustainable development, and well-being for all. In the light of this, the cooperation amongst distinct stakeholders of society and at all levels of governance is necessary to build together a new eco-social contract. In this respect, development diplomacy is an inclusive diplomacy in terms of spaces, actors, and the way to act, as it applies to both the local and global level, among themselves ultimately interconnected and interdependent, and therefore contribute to strengthen the collective actions for sustainable development problem solving and inclusive sustainable development. And fourth, sustainable development governance is crucial for the achievements of the SDGs. Development diplomacy furthers by its approach good governance practices in any collective action and multi-stakeholder undertakings for sustainable development by introducing in negotiation and mediation human rights principles, governance standards, and rules for transparency, accountability, and obligations of the involved stakeholders. In this regard, development diplomacy applies in policy and decision-making, accountability and reporting, in multilateral governance and in multi-stakeholder governance spaces and initiatives, as well as in the interface of multi-level governance and including civil society organizations and private sector, among others. Also, most importantly, is transparent and public reporting on what has been committed by governments, corporates, and NGOs, among others, towards their constituency in terms of compliance with the respective sustainable development governance standards or the SDGs. Therefore, development diplomacy can be used as well to advocate at the local and multilateral level for strengthening the accountability mechanism, arguing for more institutional and political coherence with the SDGs, and pleading for more inclusive participation of the members of the respective constituencies, beneficiaries, and impacted. Following, I would like to highlight the role and value added for development diplomacy to contribute building and advance a new eco-social contract from the bottom up and progressing to all levels. Therefore, I will emphasize first the value added of development diplomacy's practice to further actors' relations and cooperation based on inclusiveness, equal terms, and human rights values, which are all key to build a new eco-social contract from the bottom and to deliver on the challenge to advance it to all levels. Namely, all categories of actors from the civil society, governments, multilateral institutions, among others, at the collective and individual level might apply development diplomacy in communication, dialogue, consensus building, advocacy, negotiation and mediation, in policy and decision-making processes for collective actions for inclusive sustainable development, Development diplomacy fosters at work dialogue, partnerships, and cooperation among and between distant actors and among societies based on equal terms, and creating conjointly understanding and trust among them. Thus, as well, favours social to behavioral changes needed for just and inclusive societies and sustaining a living planet. At the multilateral stage, development diplomacy is serving new and emerging forms of actor relations beyond the established bilateral and multilateral cooperation, strengthening more inclusive forms of multilateralism as multi-stakeholderism, as well as diverse forms of participation of civil society organizations, social groups, youth, women, and from private sector, among others, in the work of international organizations, especially also the UN itself. Second, the value added of development diplomacy in terms of content approach, namely by its strategy-driven practice based on essentials and principles, which are key enablers to achieve the UN Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, serve to shape the messaging, framing, negotiation, mediation, and advocacy for a new eco-social contract. In this respect, all actors applying development diplomacy, essentials and principles at work, strengthen and bring the social and environmental dimension together to shape commitments, policies, norms, institutional coherence for sustainable development, actionable, sustainable, and just problem solving. Also, this contributes to competence and skills development, enabling for transformative change of economies and societies, for inclusive sustainable development, shared well-being, and to sustain a viable environment. Furthermore, in the context to build a new eco-social contract, development diplomacy's practice further sustainable development governance by grounding in communication, negotiation, and mediation human rights principles, governance standards and rules for transparency, accountability, and obligations of the respective stakeholders towards their constituencies, and ensure participation and empowerment of those who are beneficiaries or impacted for shared well-being. In terms of concluding remarks on challenges and perspectives of development diplomacy, to further collective actions for sustainability problem solving and to contribute to building and advance a new eco-social contract, I would like to resume the following challenges. To conduct development diplomacy successfully, the local and global actors, coalitions, aiming collective actions in response to interconnected global challenges for sustainable development, must adopt an integrated approach across sectors and at all levels of governance. Realistically, these coalitions have to be targeted between willing and leading actors, definitely challenged by today's difficult context for local and international cooperation, marked by divides and polarization, and within societies and between nations due to the rising inequalities, amplified by climate change, collapse in biodiversity, the impacts of COVID pandemic, increasing extreme poverty and hunger, as well as the rise of nationalism, violation of human rights, and the growing number of armed conflicts worldwide. I hope that I could show you with my presentation and arguments that development diplomacy has far-reaching perspectives to become an enabling diplomatic practice for local and global actors for building and advance the new eco-social contract in support of the achievements of the Agenda 2030 for sustainable development. Furthermore, development diplomacy can contribute to building a new diplomatic culture for sustainable development and peace, as communication, as negotiation, and as advocacy for sustainable development and peace. Teaming up like-minded actors for shaping local and international cooperation to this aim. Finally, civil society actors performing development diplomacy at work to lead bottom-up processes for collective initiatives for inclusive sustainable development are empowered to lay the ground for people's initiatives, formal national laws, international arrangements, institutional reforms, and accountability mechanisms to secure human rights for all, social, economic, and environmental justice, to overcome inequalities and to stop environmental degradation, and thus contribute to building and advance a new eco-social contract at all levels. Thank you very much for your attention.